nice to see some people could make it on a rainy day like this. We have Erin Reilly-Sanders here from the School of Teaching and Learning who teaches children's literature. So she's the perfect person for the topic she's going to read about, chills and thrills. And I haven't met a kid yet who didn't like ghost stories or scary stories. And I'm sure she has a great selection. It looks like quite a pile. So, Erin, would you like to get started?
I would love to. Thank you so much. This is a selection of books that I picked for our sort of cold and blustery October afternoons, with the idea that these books have some really beautiful language in it. So the language itself is sort of chilling, and then the stories that they start to develop hopefully are thrilling. They're not going to be, jump out and scare you stories, but hopefully they'll draw you in with their sort of spooky scenes. The first one is The Graveyard Book. This is by Neil Gaiman, one of my all-time favorite authors. He has a really wonderful cadence to his writing as well as his reading. If you get this on audio, it takes a little bit of time to get used to, but once you get into it, it's amazing. This is technically a children's book, but is perfectly acceptable for adult audiences. And I'm going to start at the beginning, and we'll give you just a little bit of this. This is from the first chapter, How Nobody Came to the Graveyard. There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife. It's illustrated too. The knife had a handle of polished black bone and a blade finer and sharper than any razor. If it sliced you, you might not even know you had been cut, not immediately. The knife had done almost everything it was brought to that house to do. Both the blade and the handle were wet. The street door was still open, just a little, where the knife and the man who held it had slipped in, and wisps of nighttime mist slithered and twined into the house through the open door. The man, Jack, paused on the landing. With his left hand, he pulled a large white handkerchief from the pocket of his black coat, and with it he wiped off the knife and his gloved right hand, which had been holding it. Then he put the handkerchief away. The hunt was almost over. He had left the woman in her bed, the man on the bedroom floor, the older child in her brightly colored bedroom, surrounded by toys and a half-finished model. That left only the little one, a baby, barely a toddler, to take care of. One more, and his task would be done. He flexed his fingers. The man Jack was, above all things, a professional, or so he told himself, and he would not allow himself to smile until the job was finished. His hair was dark and his eyes were dark, and he wore black leather gloves of the thinnest lambskin. The toddler's room was at the very top of the house. The man Jack walked up the stairs, his feet silent on the carpeting. Then he pushed open the attic door and he walked in. His shoes were black leather, and they were polished to such a shine that they looked like dark mirrors. You could see the moon reflected in them, tiny and half full. The real moon shone through the casement window. Its light was not bright, and it was diffused by mist, but the man Jack would not need much light. The moonlight was enough. It would do. He could make out the shape of the child in the crib, head and limbs and torso. The crib had high, slatted sides to keep the child from getting out. Jack leaned over, raised his right hand, the one holding the knife, and he aimed for the chest. And then he lowered his hand. The shape in the crib was a teddy bear. There was no child. The man Jack's eyes were accustomed to the dim moonlight, so he had no desire to turn on an electric light. And light was not that important after all. He had other skills. The man Jack sniffed the air. He ignored the scents that had come into the room with him, dismissed the scents that he could safely ignore, honed in on the smell of the thing he had come to find. He could smell the child, a milky smell like chocolate chip cookies and the sour tang of a wet, disposable nighttime diaper. He could smell the baby shampoo in its hair, something small and rubbery, a toy, he thought. And then, no, something to suck that the child had been carrying. The child had been here, It was here no longer. The man Jack followed his nose down the stairs through the middle of the tall, thin house. He inspected the bathroom, the kitchen, the airing cupboard, and finally the downstairs hall, in which there was nothing to be seen but the family's bicycles, a pile of shopping bags, a fallen diaper, and stray tendrils of fog that had insinuated themselves into the hall from the open door to the street. The man Jack made a small noise then, a grunt that contained in it both satisfaction and frustration. He slipped the knife into its sheath in the inside pocket of his long coat, and he stepped out into the street. There was moonlight, and there were street lights, but the fog stifled everything, muted light and muffled sound, and made the night shadowy and treacherous. He looked down the hill towards the light of the closed shops, then up the street, where the last high houses wound up the hill on their way to the darkness of the old graveyard. The man Jack sniffed the air, then, without hurrying, he began to walk up the hill. Ever since the child had learned to walk, he had been his mother's and father's despair and delight, for there never was such a boy for wandering, for climbing things, for getting into and out of things. That night, he had been woken by the sound of something on the floor beneath him falling with a crash. Awake, he soon became bored and had begun looking for a way out of his crib. It had high sides, like the walls of his playpen downstairs, but he was convinced that he could scale it. All he needed was a step. He pulled his large golden teddy bear into the corner of the crib. Then, holding the railing in his tiny hands, he put his foot into the bear's lap, the other foot up on the bear's head, and he pulled himself up into a standing position. And then he half climbed, half toppled over the railing and out of the crib. He landed with a muffled thump onto a small mound of furry, fuzzy toys, some of them presents from relations from his first birthday, not 6 months gone, some of them inherited from his older sister. He was surprised when he hit the floor, but he did not cry out. If you cried, they came and put you back in the crib. He crawled out of the room. Stairs that went up were tricky things, and he had not yet entirely mastered them. Stairs that went down, however, he discovered, were fairly simple. He did them sitting down, bumping from step to step on his well-padded bottom. He sucked on his number, the rubber pacifier his mother had just begun to tell him that he was getting too old for. His diaper had worked itself loose on his journey, on his bottom down the stairs, and when he reached the last step, when he reached the little hall and stood up, the diaper fell off. He stepped out of it. He was only wearing a child's nightshirt. The stairs that led back up to his room and to his family were steep, but the door to the street was open and inviting. The child stepped out of the house a little hesitantly. The fog wreathed around him like a long-lost friend, and then, uncertainly at first, then, with increasing speed and confidence, the boy tottered up the hill. The fog was thinner as you approached the top of the hill. The half-moon shone, not as bright as day, not by any means, but enough to see the graveyard. Enough for that. Look. You can see the abandoned funeral chapel, iron doors, padlocked, ivy on the sides of a spire, a small tree growing out of the guttering at roof level. You could see stones and tombs and vaults and memorial plaques. You could see the occasional dash or scuttle of a rabbit or vole or a weasel as it slipped out of the undergrowth and across the path. You would have seen all these things in the moonlight if you had been there that night. You might not have seen a pale, plump woman who walked the path near the front gates, and if you had seen her with a second, more careful glance, you would have realized that she was only moonlight, mist, and shadow. The pale, plump woman was there, though. She walked the path that led through a clutch of half-fallen tombstones towards the front gate. The gates were locked. They were always locked at 4 in the afternoon in winter, 8 at night in the summer. Spike-topped iron railings ran around part of the cemetery, a high brick wall around the rest. The bars of the gates were closely spaced. They would have stopped a grown man from getting through, even stopped a 10-year-old. "Owens!" called the pale woman, in a voice that might have been the rustle of the wind through the long grass. "Owens, come and look at this." She crouched down and peered at something on the ground. As a patch of shadow moved into the moonlight, revealing itself to be a grizzled man in his mid-40s. He looked down at his wife, then looked at what she was looking at, and he scratched his head. "Mistress Owens," he said, for he came from a more formal time than our own, "is that what I think it is?" And at that moment, the thing that he was inspecting seemed to catch sight of Mrs. Owens, for it opened its mouth, letting the rubber nipple it was sucking on fall to the ground, and it reached out a small, chubby fist, as if it were trying for all the world to hold on to Mrs. Owens' pale finger. "Strike me silly," said Mr. Owens, "if that isn't a baby." "Of course it's a baby," said his wife, "and the question is, what is to be done with it?" "I dare say that is a question, Mistress Owens," said her husband, "and yet it is not our question, for this here baby is unquestionably alive, and as such is nothing to do with us and is no part of our world." "Look at him smile," said Mrs. Owens. "He has the sweetest of smiles," and with one insubstantial hand she stroked the child's sparse blonde hair. The little boy giggled with delight. A chilly breeze blew across the graveyard, scattering the fog in the lower slopes of the place. For the graveyard covered the whole top of the hill, and its paths wound up the hill and down and back upon them